whether or not we can have any confidence about what's beyond our theatre of perceptions. So I don't know. Am I answering the question here? So I'm kind of an idealist.
No, that's great. Yeah.
But I've encountered so many challenges to it from the likes of yourselves, from other thinkers I've encountered in my conversations, and it's. But I still think I am one.
Yeah. You pointed out a lot of interesting threads to pull. But yeah, one thing you mentioned was even if someone like Bernardo is not correct, ultimately there's sort of a usefulness to him and what he's putting out there. But also there's a risk. I like what you said about the risk because it definitely resonates with some of my own journey in terms of being dissatisfied with something like materialism, but then finding someone who's very sure of themselves and has this kind of assertive way of presenting something alternative. And because I'm kind of floundering and not knowing where, this doesn't feel right, but also, looking for an alternative, it's easy to land in that assertiveness and kind of take it on as my own. And also not necessarily understand it fully because the community has this rhetoric and also contains assertiveness. And then just repeating the rhetoric, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm just whatever. I'm not 100% sure of Bernardo's community's rhetoric explicitly, but whatever that is.
That's so well put. But I think that, for me as well, it became a more of a structured position because it felt triangulated by the likes of Donald Hoffman, because you've now got sort of people in sort of neuroscience. Hoffman's been studying neuroscience for 30 years, the theories of perception. He's worked on perception. He's built machines and models that do this stuff. So he completely understands the optic nerve and the brain, structures and so on and so forth. But he's coming out saying that, idealism is the case. He's basically an idealist, isn't he?
Yeah.
And now he's looking to mathematize it and saying, well, actually, we can expect these kind of quantum effects given these. I still don't really understand how he builds that bridge from the, through the amplitude. I still don't really get that. I've read his paper twice on this, and I still can't. But I'm sure that's just limitations with my thinking. But there's so much going on now. Then Mike Levin actually said in a couple of interviews, said, I'm leaning towards idealism. But then more recently, he's come out and say he's leaning towards panpsychism.
There's definitely a sense that there's a definition issue within idealism, panpsych. Like, what are we talking about when we're talking about idealism?
I actually noticed that in terms of a real fuzzy boundary, it seems, in between idealists and panpsychists, in that idealists seem to think, oh, panpsychism, that's like a shade of idealism or something like that. Or that's like a fallback position for idealism if it gets too tough to kind of hold the fort, when actually it's totally different. And see, it's interesting because you said before, materialism posits this independent substance, a matter, right? And you said idealism doesn't do that. I think idealism does do that. Idealism just calls that independent substance consciousness. And something like panpsychism often proposes some kind of neutral substance, of which mind and matter are complementary aspects, like a dual aspect monism. And that seems to me to be quite a different position to idealism. Certainly not the kind of thing an idealist can fall back to, because you're very much conceding on the central thing, which is everything is consciousness. To become a panpsychist is to admit consciousness is an aspect of everything, but everything is not consciousness.
Yeah, I remember Kastrup talking about I think Philip Goff's brand of panpsychism, and I like Philip Goff. He's I enjoy his thinking. But he essentially said that it falls foul of the same problems, but you still end up with the problem of emergence. You still got to account for kind of self-aware phenomenal consciousness in humans, and so how do these kind of conscious particles kind of assemble in such a way to produce this? So you still face the same sort of problems that materialism does.
I would say that
was that one of his problems with it.
I don't think so, and that seems not quite true as well. That because the problem seems attenuated to a significant degree. You're not dealing anymore with brute emergence. You're just dealing with the emergence of complexity, which seems way more explicable.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's true.
I'm not sure how much of this kind of specific debate you guys want to get into, but
No. I think I'm happy to kind of keep it rolling, and I just think I think panpsychism, is a very attractive, plausible option, and it seems to me to leave open. See, because it seems like, I guess for me, part of the trouble I find with idealism is like at one and the same time, it's like saying everything is consciousness, and then the nature of consciousness is like being left as a question mark, which is like, whereas in panpsychism, it's like it says something that we know, which is like consciousness and matter are both aspects of what is. That seems to me like epistemologically sound. And then it says, okay, and then there's some third thing that kind of contains matter and mind as complementary aspects, which is like obviously a piece of conjecture, but like it puts that question mark. It says that this is a question mark. It doesn't say this is consciousness, and then it's secretly a question mark, right? Which to me seems very different in terms of, I guess, how transparent you're being about. Because it seems like idealists want the cake and they want to eat it too. In that, the idealist says, oh, well, my position is parsimonious and I don't posit anything more than I need to, which in a way is true, because phenomenologically, epistemologically, consciousness is fundamental, right? You start in consciousness. Every science requires consciousness. Now, that doesn't tell us what is metaphysically fundamental or ontologically fundamental. And the idealist kind of wants to say, well, I just don't make that move. I just don't go beyond consciousness. Since consciousness I know, I just don't make that move and say what the ultimate nature of reality is, except metaphysical idealists absolutely do make that move. So they're simultaneously saying, I'm staying within the bounds of what we can know. And then they're also saying, well, actually, the ultimate nature of reality is consciousness, which is absolutely not staying within those boundaries.
I think what I'm saying is that all I've ever encountered is consciousness, right? I have no grip on what's actually out there other than what I perceive, right? And that part's undeniable, right?
Yeah.
I think that's undeniable. And so so there's this case of then you say, well, what are these things that I'm observing, in my theatre of perception? And obviously, so some of them feel sort of inert and they don't sort of do much, and but some of them kind of move around and make noises like you guys, right?
Yep.
And so I don't think it's too much of a kind. I could just say, I can make an empirical appeal there and say, well, those things they're moving around, they seem like other minds, right?
They're making noise.
Yeah, true. But let's suppose that we can get through some of the sort of solipsistic concerns and say that there are other minds, right? Can we maybe?
Yeah. But the other minds are the bits that are making noise, I assume, right? Not just the bits that are just sitting there.
Yeah,
There's a fair bit of stuff that's just sitting there.
Yeah. So there's this kind of there's definitely other minds like mine, right? So there's definitely other things having an experiential journey.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
And so then the question is, well, what about all these other things, right? So tables and chairs and so on and so forth. And I would suggest that in the same way that you guys, the image of you guys, whether you're here in person or there, represent some kind of mental process, I would say that everything else does as well. And to deny it that inner kind of state, I think there's a certain kind of conceitedness about that. To say that this, for example, there is nothing going on of any kind of agential sort of nature in there. I think that's a bit crazy. Because
but you don't have to make that statement. You can just say, well, I'm open to the idea that has some kind of primitive awareness. I don't have any immediate experience. But here's the key thing is, it's not like, say, I relate to my world just as like matter and minds, like talking bits and not talking bits or something like that, right? The bits of the environment that talk to me, that the talking bit seems to be embedded in this complex matter-based body-brain thing where it's like, there's all this workings that go into making a creature like me that can make noises like me, that can understand me. And like, I look to science to understand what that is. And science is really effective at telling us about the nature, the details of the nature of the world, right? And so when I'm trying to understand, okay, how should I understand these other things, it doesn't seem like I'm just given consciousnesses in my experience. It very much seems like the other consciousnesses in my experience, like me, are conscious by virtue of having physical bodies that are built up out of smaller parts that evolved over a long period of time, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems like our like historical picture of the cosmos that, you know, seems extremely reliable in terms of making our technology work and all of that, seems to tell us that like planets and stuff were forming for a long time before there was anything like the kinds of things that we would recognize as life forms. And so it's like, okay, we can say, okay, maybe all that is kind of in some primitive way aware. Maybe awareness goes all the way down, right? Nonetheless, it's certainly a totally different kind of awareness as to whatever I mean when I'm talking about consciousness. Like you and I, we have the same noise making, you know, this apparatus. This is a very complex kind of thing, you know, and even if awareness goes all the way down, it doesn't seem that I'm given an epistemic warrant for making that final leap and going, okay, and not only does it go all the way down, but at bottom it terminates in just pure consciousness, and that is the fundamental substance of reality.
Yeah, I think you're making perfect sense there. But I think there's this other angle on this, right? So it's to do with the sort of the interconnectedness of all things, right? So let's sort of consider this. So
Yep.
You know, there's this idea. I've talked about this. You've probably heard me talk about this kind of thing, right? So take any entity, right, and it has a kind of just dependency on everything else around it. In fact, in some sense, it's almost defined by everything else around it, right?
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which, I mean, there's you know, Mike Levin, I think, is penetrating some of these boundaries, right? I think that he's kind of at least thinking about ways of examining, you know, what is beyond our kind of negotiated perception of something, right? So what are these systems kind of in themselves, or not in totality, because again, that requires a kind of metaphysical kind of utter truth about what the substrate is, but pushing a bit deeper anyway into the notion that these entities aren't really sort of distinct at all, right? You know, so this is where I possibly either get into a muddle or I get into a space that actually perhaps enables some of the other kind of idealistic tendencies, right? And that's this idea that we're part of a continuum, right? And we possess consciousness. So in that sense, the whole continuum possesses consciousness.
Sure,
Right?
but that doesn't mean that the continuum is made of consciousness.
So even if we kick panpsychism out and say, well, you know, the moon definitely doesn't have any consciousness, panpsychism is idealism, the moon is still part of a continuum that possesses consciousness. So I'm saying sort of everything is kind of involved, right? So there's kind of like a kind of metafoliation or something like that is part of a grand sort of scheme, if you like. Maybe scheme is the wrong. Not necessarily a creationist. It's not a creationist thing. It's a kind of you know, self writing sort of system, but it feels to me that we're part of a total continuum, right?
Yeah.
And so
I mean,
so the embeddedness of consciousness within that suggests to me that the whole continuum is conscious.
Yeah, and that
even by virtue of just there being one entity within it that is, if that makes sense.
For sure, yeah, and like a lot of the stuff about the interpenetration of the whole and the fractal geometry of nature, and the interconnectedness of everything that exists. I'm totally on board with that, and I think there's lots of interesting stuff to explore there. But to me, it's important to make the distinction. Like, I think you're right in saying, well, if you know it's a continuum and it possesses consciousness, then the continuum possesses consciousness. True, but that doesn't. There's a big difference between saying the continuum possesses consciousness and the continuum is made of consciousness. Those are totally different claims, and the claim that it is made of consciousness, I think, involves us in a lot of territory that the whole point of idealism, from my perspective, is, well, the materialists go further than is epistemically warranted. All we have access to is consciousness, and they say matter exists. The moment you say existence is fundamentally consciousness, you just made the same mistake that you're calling the materialists out for by overstepping and saying something beyond what you technically can know. All you can technically know is all you will ever experience. The only thing you have access to is experience. That doesn't give you a warrant to say something about the nature of existence itself. is the thing.
I think, yeah. I mean, that's a solid position, right? But this is where I think sort of intuition comes into the game as well, and a
Yeah.
feeling for this stuff. I think again, I don't think it's possible to prove that idealism is true, right?
Well, I think
I
I
don't. I
guess
mean,
my feeling is
I don't think it's possible to prove any of the kind of metaphysical positions
yeah,
are
yeah,
true.
yeah. No, I agree.
But perhaps by definition of being
Hmm.
metaphysical. But I think, as you might say, well, the world, the cosmos is made of bicycles, right? You know that's wrong, right? So there is some kind of gradation
Yeah,
of at least sense making within this, if not approaching
yeah.
truth.
Well,
Um, and so again, so just throwing some other ideas about this. Again, how do you account for a universe in which there is any activity at all? Right, without there being some sort of I don't know, like a some kind of volition, however basic. It's just hard for me to imagine that anything could possibly happen at all without any
like, is
agent.
this a question about like a prime mover or something like that?
Um, Not so much a prime mover because I don't tend to think there was ever. I don't think there was a beginning as such.
Then I'm not sure I understand the question about activity. Because if there's no beginning, then there's no need for a cause to activity. Activity probably is just an aspect of what is the case always, right? And that's kind of that is the view that I would take, that like subjectivity, consciousness is an aspect of existence, a necessary aspect of existence, but it's not the essence of existence, which to me seems like an important distinction to try to draw.
Yeah, sure. I mean, do you think it's a component of evolution? Do you think evolution has some sort of
Like, it was evolution
overarching?
guided?
Well, just evolution as a whole, sort of nature as a whole. Does it have some kind of intelligence?
Like a teleology or something.
Maybe,
Yeah.
but evolution specifically, the merit of the theory is that it works without that supposition.
But then, sort of, the evolution of life and so on. And again, I'd be interested in your views on life and abiogenesis and stuff like that. Maybe we should start with that. Sort of get to hear what you think about that, because I have this again. It's probably sort of quite intuitive, but again, I think there might be some argument for it to suggest that everything's alive, right? Because again,
Yeah.
this sort of contiguity, this sort of this contiguity. So you take a dead plant,
So-
right? Go.
Alive for me, I guess I relate to metabolic, as a maintaining of a metabolic state. So some internal state that's important, some certain conditions you need for, I can't remember what it's called, like biological equilibrium. And then, so aliveness, I think, is constituted by the regulation of those constraints within certain conditions. When they stray out the conditions, you die. Awareness, I think, is more primitive than life. And awareness seems to me to be rooted somehow in complex biological loops that arise out of, complex chemical loops that arise out of an aggregation of physical particles. As far as a specific picture of how did life start, I mean, lightning strikes the soup or something. I don't know. I don't have a specific picture. But my thought is that, like I said before, the difficulty around consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness seems to me to be significantly attenuated if we allow for awareness to be a component, because then all we need to explain is the complexification of awareness into a creature like us, which I think a lot of that work is already done, actually. Those first steps are hard to fill in, but a lot of the rest of the picture has been filled in exquisite detail.
There's something as well I want to throw in that seems to be around kind of reductionism. The sense that whatever is at the base, everything can be reduced to that base. Like, no matter what emerges, or no matter what is complex, it's not coming from nothing. It's not like a magical new popping out into existence. It's a combination of what is at base. So whatever is emergent has to both embody that at base thing by being a component, like a mixture of it in some sense. And in that sense, we have to be able to recognize the thing that is at base from every complex level of the emergent reality of existence. So in some sense, the base thing has to allow for all of this stuff.
Not only allow for, but be visible in, like a holographically distributed law, like something that is so much part of the fabric of reality that you would never think to name it, but it's part of absolutely everything you could think of.
Right. And one of the things that seems to be the case in reality is motion and change.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I think one of Matt's inquiries and pushing back is like, how does motion and change, how does that exist in something that would otherwise be possibly static or not in motion or not having change? If it's just like a fundamental rule of some kind, how does any motion emerge from that rule? If it's if it's just like A equals A or 1 = 1, whatever that rule is, like that,
No,
how does anything
for sure, yeah.
change?
I mean, I think of that, I guess, in a participatory sense, and actually, I thought of this before, when we were talking about, some of Hoffman's ideas and some of that kind of thing. But, yeah, so for me, like, I think of it like and I've used this analogy with you before, Alexander, but, like a video file on a computer, it's there, it's whole, start to finish, there's a timeline. And then, there's the question, okay, how do you get change in a static thing? Like the file doesn't change. And the answer is, well, you take a particular perspective. We're going to start at this frame and we're going to move through the object in this coordinated way. And so we participate in the object in a certain restricted way so that we get a certain picture rather than the whole thing all at once, which would not have any motion. It's taking a certain perspective that results in the phenomenon of motion and things being active. And in fact, having a perspective is what activity is perhaps best defined as, like what activity primarily, what we really mean by that is not just there being stuff happening, but the capacity to do, right? The capacity to actualize potentialities, to participate in the world, right?
The